it takes a while to get confident in who you are and how you operate. And only with that confidence can you actually write that email. Can you actually have that conversation?
So, Nate, last week we talked about how this is a very special time of year, and this is a time of year a lot of new families come into our schools. So it feels odd that in today's episode we're going to talk about how to get rid of some people out of your school. So welcome back to the podcast. I'm Daniel. This is Nate. Every week we record these episodes to help you run a mission-driven school that is fun to own and operate. And today we're responding actually to a Facebook message that was sent to me by someone who listens to the podcast. And the message said, I'm dealing with something right now. It's fresh in my mind. I wonder if you could speak about letting students and or parents, or letting go of students and or parents that aren't fitting in the culture of your music studio. Maybe they were at one point in time, but they're not anymore. And then they wrote another comment to me later and said, maybe an easy way of putting this is how to say goodbye to toxic clients. So you and I had an interesting chat about this, and it brought up several points. It brought up several ideas. So I just want to lay those out here at the beginning of the episode, and then let's just jump into it. One, the really interesting thing that you said to me, Nate, or one of the many interesting things that you said to me, was just that this was more of a problem in the past with Brooklyn Music Factory, and it was less of a problem once you really defined who your ideal customer was. Mm-hmm. And then you said that there were two primary things that you had to deal with. How do you deal with people who are trying to come in that aren't a good fit? And how do you deal with people who are inside the school that are no longer a good fit? And then maybe some ideas that I want to throw in here, perhaps along the way, or just practical tips on how to gracefully let people go. Specifically, people you don't want to work with, people who are no longer a fit or who are not sparking joy. And then three, people who have become toxic. And maybe even reveal like a quick method that lessens the chances of blowback on the studio or bad word of mouth or things of that nature. So we got a lot to cover here, Nate. And maybe let's just start right here at the beginning with that first thing you said that really intrigued me, was that a long time ago, Brooklyn Music Factory kind of came up with this idea of who the ideal client was. Now, it's going to be different for each person who's listening. So maybe who the ideal client is for BMF isn't as important as the process that you all went through to discover who that was. So I'd really like to focus in on the process. So could you tell us a little bit about that? How'd you come up with this avatar?
When you ask about the process, it's really important to understand that this isn't something that happens overnight. This is something that you discern over time. And for example, you probably didn't start. Remember, I can't remember what app we did, but we were talking about summer programs. And you were like, you talked about the genesis of the Book Blast. But you started, right? You started with this idea of, well, I need to serve my students over the summer. And then as you got into it, you realized, ooh, I have a real opportunity of what I can promise. So that's part of the process is, trial and error, figuring out what you're actually going to deliver with your students. And then, coming up with the methodology that best is going to suit what you want to deliver on. Of course, that also is trial and error. You're figuring out what curriculums you might want to license, what book methods you want to adopt, and then what you want to create on your own. Now, I was in preparation for this app. I interviewed Jessica, who's our director of family communications, and I was asking her this very question because I read this post. You shared it with me, and I was like, Jess, how would you respond to this? What are your techniques for letting people go? And she opened with a comment, that you shared, which was she said, it was really hard in the first few years to not accept everybody who wanted to join the factory, who wanted to join the community, because it takes a while to develop the confidence in what your culture is. It takes a while to develop the confidence to say, this is exactly who we are, this is how we do it, and this is what we'll provide. So I only share that because I think everybody listening needs to understand that there's a patience that's required to become more and more comfortable and confident in communicating that piece. So I don't know if that fully covers process, but maybe that's a good pause point. around that.
Then maybe what would be helpful is to go into that second idea of the two situations in which, you know, Brooklyn Music Factory has either had to say goodbye to a client or say, I don't think we're a good fit.
Yeah. Okay. So can I give some examples? And then I also want to ping pong back to you around techniques too, because I think it'd be really interesting to hear how you might handle these. Here's a couple of examples. Here's a real example. A family absolutely loves a teacher at BMF, right? And they say, but my student is getting more and more interested in classical music. Can they please just stay with this teacher, and can we start to study the literature? And so that's an example of a family that's at BMF that really likes the teacher, the relationship that's been developed with the teacher, but actually is looking for something different in terms of an outcome, right? Because you're not going to come to BMF and show that you can, play a recital of Chopin nocturnes or something. That would just never, ever happen here, right? So that's an example of someone who's within our community where we're just no longer the right fit. And so that's an example of someone where you have to figure out how to skillfully encourage them to go elsewhere, even though they love this teacher, right? Because the teacher, of course, is a great fit for our culture. They wouldn't be teaching here otherwise. But to have her to just go off script, as Jessica put it, she says, you cannot adapt and bend. You have to know who you are. You have to know what your mission, purpose, and values are, and you have to stick to them. Right? We've done whole episodes on what happens when you go off script. An example of a family who's requesting to come, to join. Well, you get those inquiries all the time. Actually, Jessica told me a really fascinating story about a family. She's like, I never told you this one, Nate. And she often doesn't tell me about the families that are not, that either she's coaching out or encouraging to go elsewhere when they inquire. But she said there was a family that was at BMF for X number of years and then left. And she said it was not a good culture fit. They needed something else, right? They were never, and in her words, she said they really were struggling with the communal piece. Build communities literally in our tagline. So if you're not interested in having your child collaborate with other children, then BMF is not a good culture fit. If you need that one-to-one attention with a single person recital that celebrates only your child, well, there's great opportunities for that in Brooklyn, but we're not the place. So this family left, and then a couple of years later came back and said, you know what? Our daughter just really misses BMF. Can she come back? And at this point, she wanted to join an advanced band. The thing is that in being an advanced band, you have to be in the private lesson program, et cetera. You have to actually be committed to growing on an instrument, and now you're in a band. And so Jessica just simply said, look, and he said, apparently this parent was just like, listen, we'd love to have them come back. They'll literally do anything. They'll play tambourine in the band if they could just come back. And Jessica was like, obviously not a good culture fit.
Right.
So those are those examples. Now, how do we skillfully encourage them to go elsewhere? Maybe we go there next.
Well, I think that's where, in the spirit of some of those episodes you just referenced, that's where I think these specific techniques that one might use to gracefully handle some of these high pressure situations. I know that for my part, figuring out what those graceful techniques were really helped make my job a lot more satisfying. I experienced less anxiety when I was dealing with folks. I created a belief within myself that I could handle that. So I went into interactions much more relaxed because I knew I had some phrases at the ready if something came up. So would that be a good place to go now, Nate? Would it be good to to go into some of the specifics?
And Daniel, I'm going to be, this, like I'm actually conflict averse. So
sure.
I don't have the same depth of belief, especially around coaching someone out or saying like, absolutely not. My depth of belief is in our purpose and our values, etc. But I'm not great at that nuanced communication technique. So I'm psyched to get some, and I've got a few too that Jessica shared that I want to share here too. But I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Okay, good. Well, let's start with the first one. We'll go from easier to hard. Okay.
Nice.
Here's the easiest one. Just people you don't want to work with. So at the consult or at the trial level, you might have someone that they filled out a lead form, you're speaking to them on the phone, or you've spoken to them on the phone and they're actually in for a trial now, and they've kind of, if they're at the trial, they've actually slipped through that first filter. I don't care what the reason is. Right. That is far beyond the scope of this episode. All we need to know is that, oh, here's this person. They're not a good culture fit. They won't be a good fit. I don't want to work with them. I think in one of those episodes that we referenced earlier, either the trial lesson episode specifically, which was about a month ago, I talked about a family who brought in 2 kids. And in 15 years of teaching piano, I had never met 2 more poorly behaved children, ever. There was no way they were getting in. And I actually even referenced this in that episode, but I think it bears repeating again. The way you deal with this is to not put anyone under pressure on the spot. I never saw it as my job to inform the parent that they had a problem. I didn't want to make anyone, quote unquote, feel bad by, just saying whatever was on my mind. I might be comfortable in these situations, but I am no Larry David from Curb Your Enthusiasm, who just is a social assassin, so to speak, just says these really nasty things in social situations. That's just not me. In a normal trial lesson, if I wanted to work with the family, I would just ask them what worked for them. I would show them my schedule. We would pick it together right there. I'd send the follow-up email right there, and then they'd be registered. If it was someone that I just didn't think was a good fit, I would basically say, hey, let me follow up with you later. I'll get your availability. I'll compare my calendar, and then we can figure out how to make this work. And then they would send their availability later and not have the information on my side of the table, and then I could just send a denial at that point.
Yeah. That
doesn't necessarily address the situation. In the example you gave earlier of this family that you just didn't feel was a good fit, the most accurate way to depict why they weren't getting in would be that we essentially, we don't want to work with you. We don't think you would be a good fit here, or we don't think you're a good fit for the culture, or you've told me your goals. I don't think you'd be a good fit. If you say that, that invites argumentation. And I think most people are uncomfortable with that. But even if you are comfortable with that, it still isn't that pleasant to be in an argument with someone when essentially you don't really care what their argument is. You've just already made up your mind. So I just think this is a much easier way to deal with that.
Well, and can I add to that? First of all, Jessica, back to your initial scheduling tactic, Jessica calls this moving them to the bottom of the priority pile, right? And then she also says, basically, she says, oftentimes I just say, I'm so sorry, we don't have anything that will fit your availability.
Yeah.
And she uses it. So she has a similar tactic. Now, to your last point, I think there's a way to reframe that, which in a sort of positive way, which is that when someone comes to BMF and says, this is like, for example, the student that was already within BMF and wants to study classical, you just flip it into how can we be of benefit to them? It's rather than do we want to work with them? It's what do they actually need? And in the case of that student, it would be totally inappropriate and honestly dishonest to keep that student at BMF, because she would always be an afterthought. She would never get nearly the type of classical piano lessons that she could have gotten up at the Hill at Brooklyn Conservatory.
Yeah.
And it would be much more beneficial to this human to say, we would strongly encourage you to go to this other school. By the way, dude, I think this, Daniel, has to do with the maturity piece that Jessica was referencing. Over time, you get so much more comfortable with knowing who you can be of benefit to, who you can serve, and who you can't. And going back to one last thing, and then I want to ping it back to you on some additional techniques, but your comment about the two children that were really misbehaved, one of the ways to frame it is, hey, you know what? These students need a very particular type of teacher in order to be able to manage them and have them succeed.
Right.
I'm not that person.
Right.
And I think that that's okay. Like, if I gave you another example, for people reach out all the time with students that have certain needs or special needs, and it's a really delicate subject, of course, right?
Yes.
Like they have different needs, and you have to say, listen, we may or may not have a teacher who's trained well enough to be able to have them succeed within our curriculum. And we're not going to take on we're not going to take on this student just because we want the enrollment if we don't know that we have that skilled, trained teacher that can handle their particular needs. And so that's I think that's another version of that story. Okay.
It is interesting, and I want to follow up on that. There are kind of two categories in which I view this. There's the category of, they want to study classical, but we're a rock and songwriting school. Oh, we don't see preschoolers, but this kid's 3 years old. I don't work with adult students. This is an adult contacting me.
Yes.
Those are much easier to deal with.
Yes, totally.
There's no perceived slight or insult that you're putting out to the other person. And in those cases, I would just send something at the email level and say, hey, sorry, I don't think I can help. Here's a teacher who I think can. And I kept a list of teachers that worked with certain kinds of students, and I would just freely distribute their information. It's just being helpful. On the other hand, the discipline thing, that is one where it's more delicate because the parent is kind of seeing their child misbehave. They know their child's misbehaving, and then all this. So I don't think it's as much about saving face as just what Jessica said. We'll put them at the bottom of the priority pile. And and that's really the point. The last point I want to make on this before I move to number 2, and that is to say that a lot of times the way to let these problems solve themselves naturally is to just be bad at your job. In other words, a school owner should be aggressively following up with any new lead, like 7 to 10 times within a few weeks of them first reaching out, or until you get in touch with them. So a lot of times what school owners find is that they reach out 1 or 2 times, and then they come to me and say, Daniel, nobody wants lessons anymore because I reach out to them, but they didn't call me back. I'm like, oh, how many times did you reach out? 1 time. Oh, why did you only reach out 1 time? Well, if they don't care enough to reach back out to me, then I don't want them. Okay, well,
that's a different issue altogether.
That's not how it works. But what is funny is that if you were just to be bad at your job and stop following up with people, most people kind of go away anyway. So if there's someone who at the phone consult level, you're like, oh man, they're so not a good fit, just start being bad at your job and they'll probably not contact you again.
Yeah, the avoidance technique.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So the first one, again, the list here is how to gracefully let people go.
Right.
The first one was just people that you don't want to work with who are not yet in. What about people who are in? That's number 2. People who are no longer fit, or who are not sparking joy. So let me give a very specific example.
Okay, sweet.
Because this isn't about a client that was really bad, or I didn't like the kid, or I was feuding with the parent. This is more like, here's a kid that at one point was super energetic, motivated, really excited to be in lessons. And then for whatever reason, they just don't feel that way anymore. And then I've got this family over here who they are aggressively following up with me. They're telling me, hey, we want to get our child in piano lessons. They can't stay away from the piano. They're asking me about it. They like to sing. They like music. They listen to music in their room as opposed to doing other activities that they could be doing. We really want to get them in the lessons. I see that, and I'm thinking, oh, man, I really want that kid in lessons as well.
Right.
And then here, but on my side of the equation, oh no, I'm out of room on my schedule. And then I've got like these 3 students over here that are barely practicing anymore. How do you let those kids go? So that's what this category is about. Or just, well, we'll get to that on number 3. So how do you let those people go? A lot of times I did a version of what I was just saying there, like being bad at your job. So when it would come time for re-enrollment,
yes,
I would actually, on one hand, I would, in terms of priority, I would send out waves of invites to get on my schedule.
Totally. And you've conveniently left off.
And I'll put them in the last wave, basically, where it's all that's left. Now, a lot of times prior to that, and this is the thing, in some of my private coaching and in some of my trainings, I have given really specific scripts to people on how to save students from quitting. Like a student that you want to work with, who for whatever reason the parent wants to enroll them, or the student's feeling a little dejected, or things like that. Like I have saved students that have gone on to study with me for years longer. That the parent was on the way out the door, and I had one phone call with them. And I saved them. And that could be an episode right there, but that's for another time.
Yeah. But we're talking about the flip.
Right. This is the flip side of that. And the thing is that I would flip. I would do the exact opposite. The things that I would say to save the student, I would literally say the exact opposite to a parent who I wanted out. And a lot of times they'd quit within 4 weeks.
Wait,
and
can you give us an example?
It wasn't hateful stuff. It was just questioning, hey, how's Sarah doing? Well, she's at home. She's not practicing much, that sort of thing. And for the family that I would want to save, I'd start asking a lot of questions about that. And I would diagnose perhaps the issue and then start speaking to the deeper realities of why maybe Sarah's going through a rough patch or whatever. So it was very nuanced. Well, what's the opposite of that for someone who I want out? Oh man, that sounds pretty bad. You probably should quit. That's the short version of it. I wouldn't be that blunt, obviously.
Yeah, I would use language like it's time to take a break.
Exactly. It was so funny because sometimes I could hear parents almost wanting not to, like trying to hold on to it. I'm just like, hey, no, it's totally fine. Take a break. Take a break for the summer. Take a break for just this semester. Reach back out to me in January, like that sort of thing. And when you would send a few communications like that, or here's the other one, a big policy, I've said this before on many past episodes, but practice was something I never nagged either students or parents about, ever. Mm-hmm. I would start nagging students I wanted out. I would start, I say nagging, I really wasn't nagging, but I would start bringing up practice quite a lot to parents. Hey, how much are they practicing at home? They're not practicing enough at home, like that sort of thing. They would be gone within 4 to 8 weeks. So that's how I would
that's super interesting.
Manage people out. Yep.
I asked the same question. I was interviewing Jess in anticipation of this episode, and she said, what one of her techniques is you can tell a family is struggling when they start asking about all the policies. Like, well, how come there's only one makeup? Wait a minute, it's June, and you're billing me the same amount, even though there's only 2 lessons, and you're re-explaining. There's always pushback. And so it feels sort of similar where Jessica could be like, these are the policies. We don't bend on them. It sounds like maybe this isn't the right fit for you all. If you want a pay per lesson model, there are other opportunities.
Want to go to number 3?
Yeah, I do want to go to number 3.
Okay.
What do we got?
So gracefully letting people go. First category of people was people you don't want to work with. Second category of people is students or parents that are no longer a good fit or not sparking joy or that sort of thing. Third is people or clients who've actually become toxic, or a subset of that would be students that have become disruptive, or how do I put this? Their conduct within a class environment has been less than ideal, or even rude or insulting or wrong towards another student. Things like this, like truly a bad situation. How do you deal with that? And my goal with this one is just to give a quick method that lessens the chance of blowback, as I said at the top of the episode.
Yeah,
we don't want a nasty review on Google. We don't want negative word of mouth getting around. We want to deal with the situation professionally, and we want to escort them out the door. Hopefully, we don't need security to escort them off the premises. This has happened a few times. I'm probably not going to get into specifics just because I don't know that that's all that important. But I will give generalities. So I'll give two. There was one situation where the student said that something happened in a lesson that didn't. It wasn't like super scandalous. It was nothing like that. But it was just, it was honestly a lie about a thing that I'd said to the student. It isn't the kind of thing that I would say to a student. I know I didn't say it to the student, but the student insisted to their parent that they did. And the parent took the side of the student. They just assumed that I was lying. And what's interesting about that, and just to be even more clear, the student said that I said something to them that was very critical of them. And it's not in my nature to do that. It's not something I ever would have done. So I don't know what was going on with that student. It was a somewhat new student, and the student wasn't really that well behaved, I found out after they got into the studio. So I think there was just something going on there. Anyway, I simply followed up. The parent followed up with me by email, and I followed up and said that I would be uncomfortable having the student come back, given what they said that I was saying and that I had not said it. And that I think really we should just kind of part ways, and that I would send them a refund for the month that they had been in. And I'd already done a couple of the lessons, but I just refunded their entire tuition for that month, even though it wasn't owed them. I just wanted a very nice, clean break. I didn't want to talk to this parent again ever. And they took me up on the offer. So that was one way. That one, it's a little more cut and dried. Let me give one that's a little messier. I had a student that they had a great trial, and then they did well. They were high energy, but it was nothing that I couldn't handle. And then when they actually got into the context of the 1 hour group, their behavior kind of fell apart. And it was kind of surprising to me because this was an older kid. It was like 8 or 9. And then what ended up coming out that the parents didn't tell me throughout the entire process was that this student had like an attention issue. And what I discovered in that was that they had kind of hidden that because they were concerned that I wouldn't take the student. Which, let me tell, so there's a little bit of dishonesty on the parents' part in making an assumption and then wanting to kind of pull one over on me. Well, here's the interesting thing. I had a student that I started in 2008, and I don't feel bad talking about this because this parent, well, everyone listening will understand when I say this. But I started a couple kids all from the same family, and one had challenges as it came to emotional control and also just their ability to learn. I worked with that student for 7 years one-on-one. I had no problem working with a student that has challenges. But that student I never would have put in one of my groups. It wouldn't have been fair to her.
Right.
And this particular mother, she said, Daniel, I've always told my friends when I recommend you, the thing I love about Daniel is that he treated all 3 of my girls in a different way because he saw that they all needed something different. And what I saw that this particular student needed was just to work with me one-to-one. And even after I stopped teaching one-to-one, I kept this student just because. And so it is not as if I wouldn't have taken this student necessarily. It's just that I knew it wasn't a good fit. And so we get a couple weeks into this, and this student is disregarding everything I'm saying, is like laying over the piano bench. I turned around once, and this particular student was just laying on the floor, just like staring at the ceiling. I was like, I am not comfortable with this. Like, I could direct this behavior in the context of a one-to-one lesson. I could 100% engage them, keep their attention.
Right.
But in the context of a group where my entire group method actually does put pressure on the student to take control of their own learning, and I had a way of making that happen. This student clearly isn't up to that challenge. And had the parent been honest with me, I could have told them from the outset that this wasn't going to be a good environment for their child, but they lied to me. So I'm thinking, well, how do I deal with this? And so I thought about just sending a breakup email, kind of like that other student that I said, but I thought, I don't think that's going to go over well because they've already kind of shown their character, revealed their character. And so I actually had a phone call with them and I explained the behavior. And then I explained a version of what I just said there. And I said, just at this time right now, if you would have told me about this, I would have said, I don't have any room on my private lesson calendar, which was not a lie. At that time in my career, I was only working with advanced students one-to-one. So I did have a private lesson calendar. That was not a lie, but I absolutely did not work with beginners one-to-one ever. No exceptions for like the last 5 or 6 years of my career teaching. And so point being that I just said, I have some teachers I can recommend that I know will be able to work one-on-one with your child. And here's their information, but I'm going to refund this month to you. And, I honestly can't remember exactly what I said. I don't think I would have been as blunt to say unenroll you, but would have said, I just think it's going to be best if I kind of give, this other teacher's name to you, reach out to them. I know that they work with students of all types, all learning styles, and I just recommend you reach out to them. So it was very clear that we were breaking up, so to speak.
Right. So you got a breakup email, but in this case, it's more delicate. So you have a breakup phone call. Yeah. Is there any other version of this technique? Let
me say one. Let me give one other example.
Okay.
I had a family. So, and this goes to actually the fella who Facebook messaged me and said, "Hey, how do you say goodbye to toxic parents?" I had a family that the parent signed up for the final slot of the day. And the first couple of weeks brought the child. The child was a great student, really liked him. And third or fourth week into the lessons, it gets to be the end of the hour, final thing. I am a very orderly, punctual person. So if the hour ended at 7:35, I often had those kids in the car and gone by 7:36 and 30 seconds. Like 90 seconds later, everybody's gone from the studio.
Right.
And my wife is also a very punctual type A person, and she will have made food and timed it so that it was getting done right at 7:35. And I literally would walk back in the house and we'd watch our favorite show together or whatever show we were watching at the time. And this was our pattern 4 nights a week. We would have dinner immediately afterward. This went on for years and years with virtually no interruption. It wasn't very often I had a late student. Anyway, so 7:35 rolls around. I know I'm being a little long-winded, but I'm just giving some color commentary here. Anyway, 7:35 rolls around. This student, I escort all the students out. Not only is the other parent not there, I don't even see them. I don't have a message from them. They showed up 15 minutes late. This had never happened to me in over a decade of teaching. I was not happy.
Right.
So parent came there. He explained, like, I've been at the grocery store, couldn't get out of line, was checking out, blah, blah, blah. Okay, cool. This happened a couple more times over like the next month or two. And every time it was like, I was at the grocery store. I sent emails. I said, hey, you need to be here at 7:35. I even charged them more one month, hoping they would quit. They didn't. I put more on the bill just to make up for my time. So I literally charged him my full hourly rate as if I had 5 students there for those 15 minutes that I had to wait, because he was showing up consistently like 10 to 15 minutes late.
Let's just call it this.
Yeah.
And I'll bill you for it.
Exactly. Then, and I'm not even going to get into it, but at our year-end recital, right before we went on Christmas break, they showed up late and then actually made a scene at the recital while it was going on, while another student was playing. That was like the final straw for me. Okay, I I did not send them a re-registration form for the next semester.
Right.
And then they emailed me and said, "Hey, what's our time?" And I just said, "You can't come back." I just sent them an email and said, "Look, there's a number of things that have happened over the last 4 or 5 months. I really like working with the student." I said the student's name, obviously. I really like working with student, your son, but this is not working out, and there have just been too many violations, basically, and sent that email. So that's another way that I dealt with just a really ugly situation. So at the end of the day, if all we're saying here is, oh yeah, you either need to send an email or a phone call, well, that'd be kind of underwhelming. I wanted to give the context of each situation and the specific verbiage and what I actually did, because I think for anyone who's hearing this, especially if you're more introverted or you are you feel uncomfortable in confrontational situations, I think hearing how I actually talk to people, what I actually wrote, what I actually said can be helpful. I know in the past from other clients I've heard that it's been really, really helpful to hear those specificities, because then they can begin to imagine what their version of it would be, and then they kind of pick up the mantle and take it back to their studio and feel more confident to deal with these situations in their own business.
I think it's like, in closing, Daniel, what I hear in this episode is that there's an element of, first of all, like in your stories, you're owning your parameters within which you can work and be a success with the student. And so there's that piece, right? So when we talk about culture fit, I think there's that personal, you're like, you run a tight ship and you expect people to be on time, and you're honoring that. So you expect that from the parents too. And that's actually part of your culture, honestly. So I hear that. I hear understanding your culture of your studio. I hear also understanding what is essential to you to remain energized and joyful. And then the second piece that I hear is like, it's not, you can have the best techniques in the world. The reality is sometimes it's difficult. Sometimes it's ugly. Sometimes you have to write that last email, which is like, hey, you know why? These things were a violation of how we work in my studio. And so I think that actually is like a nice circle around to that opening share that Jessica had, which is like, it takes a while to get confident in who you are and how you operate. And only with that confidence can you actually write that email. Can you actually have that conversation? The techniques aren't necessarily sexy, honestly. They just are. We are just being within the clarity of who we are and how we operate.